My name is Belinda, and my life was perfect, or so I thought, before that day. I was 30, married to a wonderful man, Charles. He was everything I had ever wanted. Kind, funny, strong, and completely devoted to me. For years, we built our lives together, day by day, dreaming about the future, about kids, about retirement on some beach. It was a life I thought was impenetrable. But life, as I came to learn, can be so cruelly unpredictable. It was a Tuesday, an ordinary Tuesday, when I got the call. I was sitting in our living room sipping my coffee, the kind of morning where everything is quiet, peaceful. Then, the phone rang. "Belinda, it's Jude. It's Charles. There's been an accident." I didn't understand what he was saying. The words didn't connect in my mind. An accident? Charles? What was happening? Jude's voice, trembling, filled the space between us like the ominous ticking of a clock. It was a blur of noise, ambulances, the sound of engines, and Jude urging me to get to the hospital. But by the time I arrived, it was too late. Charles was gone. There was no warning, no indication that our time together had an expiration date. He was just gone. The funeral came and went, as funerals often do. A flurry of black dresses, sorrowful faces, condolences that meant little but were necessary, like the flowers that piled up. I stood there, numb, my mind unwilling to accept that he was gone. Charles had always been there. How could I be standing over his grave now? It didn't make sense. The worst part wasn't just losing him. It was the feeling of helplessness that followed. People around me grieved in their own ways, offering their condolences, but none of them truly understood how empty I felt. None of them knew what it was like to have your whole world collapse into a void. My life was defined by him, and now he was just gone. Jude, Charles's best friend, was there, of course. He had been there the whole time. His face was as pale as mine, but somehow I could see a depth of grief in him that I hadn't expected. I knew he loved Charles, but standing next to me, so quiet and somber, I could feel something else, a sort of shared grief, a bond that wasn't just about the loss of a friend. After the funeral, the house felt unbearable. It was too silent, too empty. The things I used to enjoy seemed so trivial. I couldn't remember a time when everything felt so disconnected. There were moments when I would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for Charles, only to find nothing but cold sheets beside me. I would cry, even though I didn't know what for. Was it because he was gone, or because I didn't know who I was without him? Jude started visiting a couple of days after the funeral. He said it was to check on me, to make sure I was all right. At first, I welcomed him. He and Charles had been inseparable since high school, and he'd always been like a brother to me. He knew me, my mannerisms, my thoughts. He knew Charles better than anyone, so having him there felt like something familiar in a world that suddenly felt strange. Jude was always the strong one, the one who never seemed to falter. But when he looked at me, his eyes were different, softer, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I thought it was just grief clouding my judgment, but there was something about him in those moments that felt personal. One evening, a week after the funeral, I sat in the living room, my hands clasped around a cup of tea. Jude had just arrived and we sat in silence for a while, neither of us knowing what to say. Then he spoke. "Belinda, I know this is hard. I know nothing anyone says is going to help. But I just want you to know I'm here for you, always." The words were comforting, and I felt a strange warmth spread through me. But as I looked at him, something else stirred inside me. It was a fleeting thought, something I tried to push away. After all, I was married, and my husband was just buried. The guilt hit me almost immediately. "You're not alone," Jude added, his voice almost too soft, too intimate. I swallowed hard, looking away, afraid that if I looked at him too long, I would see something else, something that wasn't just grief, but it was there. A look in his eyes that wasn't entirely friendly, and in that moment, I understood that this was more than just a friend consoling a widow. I could feel it. He was attracted to me. I didn't know what to think. What could I think? This was Jude, Charles's best friend. He was supposed to be there for me. But what was I supposed to do with this new, confusing feeling? I wanted to pull away, to shut it all down, but I didn't. "I know," I said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "I just don't know how to move forward, Jude. Everything feels like it's fallen apart." "I know," he repeated, his voice lower now, "but we'll figure it out, together." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. I felt his presence beside me, strong and steady. I couldn't help but lean into it, even just a little. It felt good to be held in that space, to feel his strength. And then, without thinking, I asked him, "How are you holding up?" Jude looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. But behind that sadness, there was something else. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. But I couldn't stop myself from wondering, was he grieving for Charles, or for me? That was the first moment, the first time I felt a shift, a small, dangerous shift, and little did I know, that was the beginning of a chain of events that would change everything. The days after Charles's funeral blurred together in a haze. The grief never fully left me, but neither did Jude. In fact, Jude's visits became more frequent. It started out as a simple check-in, but soon it felt like something more. A sense of companionship that I hadn't realized I needed. Jude was always there, a constant presence in my life during my darkest moments. I was still reeling from the loss of Charles, but with Jude around, I began to feel something else, something unexpected. At first, I brushed it off as an unfortunate consequence of grief. It wasn't uncommon for widows to experience emotional confusion after the death of their spouse. But every time Jude was near, I found myself drawn to him. His voice, his smile, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long when we spoke. It wasn't just pity anymore. It wasn't just about comfort. I wasn't sure when it happened, when I started seeing Jude in a different light. The first few weeks were filled with awkward silences and polite conversations. I kept my distance, even though a part of me longed to get closer. But then, one night, everything changed. It was a Friday evening, and the house felt colder than usual. The house had always felt warm with Charles in it, but now, even with the heat on full blast, it felt as if the walls were closing in. Jude arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the living room. He looked tired, his usual composure slightly cracked. I could see the fatigue in his eyes. He wasn't just grieving, he was worn out by the weight of it all. He settled down on the couch next to me. A part of me wanted to pull away, but there was also a part that wanted him closer. I didn't know how to reconcile those two sides of me. "How are you holding up, Belinda?" Jude asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. I could feel his concern, but there was something else in it, a hidden layer. Maybe I was just imagining it. After all, he was still mourning Charles, wasn't he? And yet, I couldn't ignore the way his gaze lingered on me as I answered, I'm getting by. It's hard, really hard. I paused, trying to gather my thoughts. I don't know how to be without him, Jude. I don't even know who I am without Charles. Jude looked at me, his expression softening. He placed a hand on mine, just for a moment, but the touch sent an unexpected jolt through me. My breath caught in my throat. I know it's hard, he said, his voice low, steady, but you're not alone in this. I'm here, Belinda, always. And that was when I felt it, the spark. It was subtle at first, a flicker deep inside me. It wasn't just the sympathy or the comfort I craved. It was something more. The way his hand felt on mine. The way his thumb brushed against my skin. I could feel the heat radiating from his touch, and it was impossible to ignore the pull between us. I looked down at his hand on mine, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But another part of me, something darker, something raw, wanted more. I wanted to feel something again. I wanted to feel alive, to feel desired. You're a good man, Jude, I whispered, my voice trembling. You've always been there for me, for Charles. I don't know how to thank you for everything. Jude's fingers tightened slightly around mine, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with emotion. Belinda, you don't need to thank me. I care about you, I always have. His voice dropped even lower, and for a moment the world around us seemed to disappear. You don't have to do this alone. I knew what he meant. There was no mistaking it. His words were clear, even if they were unspoken. And when he leaned in, his face only inches from mine, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I could smell the familiar scent of his cologne, something earthy and woodsy. It was comforting, yet it made my pulse quicken. Jude, I breathed, my heart pounding in my chest. Before I knew it, his lips were on mine. It was a soft kiss at first, gentle, almost tentative, as if we were both waiting for permission. But that hesitation didn't last long. As soon as I felt the pressure of his lips, I couldn't stop myself. I kissed him back, harder, more desperately, as if I had been starved for touch. His hands moved to my face, cradling me as if he had been waiting for this moment just as much as I had. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Minutes? Hours? The world had faded away, leaving only the heat between us, the longing, the need. I pulled him closer, feeling his body against mine, the weight of him both grounding and exhilarating. The guilt, the confusion, it all faded into the background as I gave in to the desire that had been building between us for weeks. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, I felt dizzy. My head was spinning, and for a moment, I couldn't remember who I was. Who was I now? I wasn't just a widow anymore. I wasn't just Charles's wife. I was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to face. I shouldn't have done that, I whispered, my hands trembling as I pushed myself away from him. But Jude didn't move. Instead, he took my hand again, holding it tightly. You don't have to apologize, he said softly. We're both hurting, Belinda. We both need this. Just let it happen. I pulled my hand away, feeling the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something we had both wanted. Something we had both been too afraid to acknowledge. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. My heart was still racing, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. But deep down, I knew one thing for certain. Things had changed between us. Forever. In the days that followed, everything about my life began to feel like a delicate web, each strand carefully woven together, but ready to snap at any moment. My days were a constant blur of pretending, I had to pretend that I was okay. I had to pretend that nothing had changed. But of course, everything had changed. Jude's visits became more frequent. It started off small, an occasional text, a call to check on me. But soon, it was as if we couldn't stay away from each other. Every day, without fail, he was there. At first, it felt like a lifeline. He was the one constant in my world of chaos. But with each passing day, the lines blurred more, and I found myself lying to those around me, lying to my friends, my family, even to myself. I had never intended for this to happen. This wasn't me. I wasn't the type of woman to betray her late husband. I had loved Charles with all my heart, but somewhere in the emptiness of his absence, I found myself craving something I hadn't expected, something I couldn't control. Jude was there, comforting me, holding me, making me feel like I wasn't alone. The more time we spent together, the more I felt like I was losing a part of myself that had been tied to Charles. It wasn't just about sex, though when that happened, it was fiery, desperate, and full of longing. It was about feeling alive again, feeling desired, wanted. The guilt was a constant companion. I couldn't look at my phone without seeing the pictures of Charles that had once brought me comfort, but now served as painful reminders of what I was doing. Every time I thought about the affair, a sick feeling twisted in my stomach, but I couldn't stop it. Jude's touch, his words, the way he made me feel, it was too much. It was intoxicating. We had crossed a line. There was no going back now. One evening, Jude showed up at my door just as the sun was setting. His face was different today, more intense, more purposeful. There was no hint of the awkwardness that had lingered in the air the first time we kissed. We had crossed into dangerous territory, and neither of us had any intention of stepping back. "Hey," he greeted, his voice low, almost hushed, as if we were playing a game. The way he said it made me feel like we were already in on a secret together. "Hi," I said, almost too quickly, as if I were waiting for him to sweep me up into another moment that I wasn't sure I could control. I stepped aside, letting him in. We didn't speak for a while. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was charged. We had a million unspoken things hanging between us, and each one seemed to bring us closer to the edge. I led him to the couch, where we both sat side by side. The usual tension was there, but now it felt familiar. It felt comfortable. Jude's hand brushed mine, and my heart skipped a beat. He didn't pull away this time. Neither of us did. "I've been thinking about this, about us," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, but his words were filled with something much deeper. "About everything that's happened. The guilt you must feel, but also the desire. It's confusing, I know." I nodded, unable to find the right words. What could I say? That I was drowning in guilt. That I loved my husband, but that I couldn't stop myself from wanting Jude. "I don't want you to feel like you're doing something wrong," Jude continued. "I don't want you to feel guilty for feeling what you feel. But I also know we can't keep pretending like nothing's happening between us. Can we?" His words hit me like a wave, crashing over me. I hadn't even realized I was holding my breath until I exhaled slowly. What did that mean? Did he want more? Was he going to ask me to choose between him and the memory of Charles? I started, but I couldn't finish. It wasn't like I didn't know what was happening, but the realization that Jude had just put our emotions out in the open terrified me. "Belinda, I don't want to pressure you," Jude said, his hand moving to my shoulder, rubbing softly. "But I think we both know that something's changed. And maybe it's not just about physical attraction. Maybe it's about filling the emptiness that's been left behind. I looked at him then, really looked at him. Jude wasn't just Charles's best friend anymore. He was someone else. Someone who had become a part of me. And the longer we were together, the more I began to realize that he wasn't just a substitute for my husband. Jude was different. He was real, present, and someone who understood the grief that had been consuming me. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Jude," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my confession. "It feels so wrong, but it feels so right at the same time. I can't." I paused, my chest tightening as I fought back tears. "I can't stop thinking about you." He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he reached for me, gently cupping my face in his hands. And in that moment, the guilt didn't matter anymore. It didn't matter that I was betraying the memory of my husband, or that I was holding on to something that wasn't supposed to be. All that mattered was the closeness between us, the electric connection that burned brighter every time we touched. "Don't worry," he said softly, his voice laced with understanding. "You're not alone in this. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Belinda. But you have to make a choice. We both do." That was the moment I realized just how far I had gone. Jude and I weren't just two people grieving anymore. We were something else entirely. Something I couldn't explain, but also something I couldn't ignore. The truth was, I had already made my choice. I just hadn't admitted it yet. It started with a subtle shift that I could no longer ignore. What began as a secret, desperate search for warmth in the midst of overwhelming loss had become a hidden life, a double life that slowly ate away at my soul. The affair with Jude had grown deeper, and with every stolen moment, my guilt and inner turmoil grew stronger. I tried to tell myself that the passion was a remedy for the emptiness left behind by Charles. But soon, I began to see the truth in harsh, unforgiving light. For weeks, I had managed to keep my secret hidden from the world. By day, I played the part of the grieving widow, smiling weakly at the sympathetic glances of friends and family, while by night, I surrendered to the reckless comfort of Jude's arms. Each time we met, I felt a mix of exhilaration and despair, a cocktail of stolen bliss and haunting regret. Jude was no longer just the friend who had stood by me after the funeral. He had become the keeper of my hidden desires and the partner in my betrayal. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon when the first real crack appeared in my carefully constructed facade. I had spent the morning tidying up the house, a futile attempt to bring order to my jumbled thoughts, and was preparing dinner when I heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so my heart pounded as I hesitated before opening it. Standing on the doorstep was Helen, Charles's older sister, her eyes red from crying, and her face etched with worry and disappointment. "Belinda, can I come in?" she asked in a trembling voice. I stepped aside to let her in, my mind racing with fear. Helen had always been close to Charles, and now that he was gone, I had hoped that her grief would be directed solely toward him. Instead, as soon as she stepped into the living room, I sensed that something was different. An unspoken question lingered in the air. "Belinda, I know it's been hard," Helen began, her voice soft, but laced with an emotion I couldn't quite pinpoint. "But I've been hearing things, whispers about what's been happening since the funeral. I want to believe it's just the pain making people talk, but I can't help but wonder if there's more." My heart sank. The secret that I had guarded so carefully was now hanging in the balance. I tried to steady my breathing, knowing that every word I spoke from now on would seal my fate. "Helen, I managed to say, my voice wavering. I'm trying my best to cope with everything. Sometimes people say things they shouldn't when they're upset. I promise you, nothing is as it seems. Her eyes searched mine, and I saw a mixture of sorrow and determination there. Belinda, I love Charles dearly, and I know how much you did too, but this feels like you're losing yourself. You're not the same woman I once knew. Her words stung, not just because they spoke of betrayal, but because they revealed how much pain I had already caused. That night, after Helen left, I sat alone in the darkness of my living room, the rain tapping on the windows like a somber drum. I thought about everything: the stolen kisses, the gentle touches, the way Jude's arms had made me forget, if only for a moment, the weight of loss. And I thought about Charles, whose memory was slowly being tarnished by my betrayal. The guilt was overwhelming, a constant reminder that no matter how much I craved the passion that Jude gave me, it came at a terrible price. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. I avoided phone calls and turned down invitations, afraid that the truth would slip out. I knew that I could not keep living in this split reality forever. Deep inside, I felt that I was on the brink of a breaking point, a moment when the lies would shatter, and I would have to face everything head on. It was during one of those sleepless nights that Jude called. His voice was low and urgent, filled with a worry I had not heard before. "Belinda, we need to talk. I can't do this any longer." His words cut through me like a knife. I had sensed his growing distress over our secret, but I had hoped that we could navigate this storm together. Instead, I found myself confronting the realization that our affair was becoming a burden neither of us could bear. I met him at a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a place that had become our secret meeting spot. The rain had stopped by the time I arrived, leaving the streets washed clean, but my soul still muddied by regret. Jude sat in a corner booth, his eyes downcast and his hands clasped tightly together. As soon as I sat across from him, he reached out and squeezed my hand, a gesture that was both comforting and heart-wrenching. "Belinda," he said, looking up with a pained expression, "I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because I need you to understand something important." His eyes searched mine, as if seeking forgiveness, but also demanding honesty. "I've been holding on to so many secrets. Secrets about Charles, about us, and about my own struggles. I thought that by being with you, I could escape the constant reminder of everything I lost. But I'm starting to see that this affair is hurting us both." His words echoed the turmoil that had been building inside me for weeks. "Jude," I whispered, "I never wanted it to go this far. I thought I was just trying to fill a void, but now I see that I'm losing myself. I'm betraying the memory of Charles, and I'm hurting the people who care about me." He nodded slowly, his face etched with regret. "I know, Belinda. I care about you so much, but I'm afraid that if we don't come clean soon, the truth will break us completely. I can't keep lying to myself or to you. I'm scared of what will happen if we continue down this path." We sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of our decisions pressing down on us like an unbearable burden. It was then that I realized the true cost of our affair. The passion that had once felt like a saving grace was now a prison, trapping me in a cycle of deceit and self-destruction. Every stolen moment was now overshadowed by the knowledge that I was slowly destroying the memory of a man I had once loved dearly. In the days that followed, the consequences of our secret began to unravel. Helen's visit had set off a chain reaction. Whispers turned into heated conversations among our mutual friends, and the air was thick with suspicion, I found myself unable to meet the eyes of those who once admired me, each glance a reminder of the betrayal I had committed. One evening, as I was sitting alone in the study, surrounded by photographs of Charles and mementos of a happier time, I received a call from my best friend Marjorie. Her voice was gentle but filled with concern as she asked if everything was all right. I hesitated, unsure of how much I could reveal without further hurting those around me. But as I listened to her, I heard the sorrow in her words, and it forced me to confront the reality of my actions. "Belinda, I know you're hurting," Marjorie said softly, "but I want you to know that no matter what, you deserve to be honest with yourself and with those who care about you. This secret is eating you up inside, and you need to face it before it consumes you completely." Her words hit me hard. I knew that I had been running away from the truth for too long. The lies, the double life, the hidden meetings, it was all unsustainable. I needed to make a choice, and it was time to come clean. I could no longer hide behind the facade of a grieving widow when the truth of my heart was causing so much pain. That decision did not come without consequences. I called Helen and asked to meet her privately, hoping to find a way to make amends. In a small park, under the shade of old oak trees, I sat with Helen as I tried to find the words to explain the inescapable guilt and regret that had been weighing me down. "Helen, I have something I need to confess," I began, my voice trembling with fear and remorse. "I have been living a lie. I allowed myself to be drawn into an affair, and I betrayed Charles, not only his memory, but also the trust of those who love me." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might turn away in anger. Instead, she reached out and took my hand gently. "Belinda, I wish you had told me sooner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know how hard it is to lose someone you love, but sometimes we try to fill that emptiness with something that only makes the pain worse." In that quiet moment, I realized that honesty was the only way forward. I had hurt so many people already, and if I wanted to find a path to forgiveness, even for myself, I needed to acknowledge the truth and accept the consequences of my actions. I promised Helen that I would seek help to understand the tangled mess of emotions inside me, and that I would try to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Meanwhile, my relationship with Jude reached a crossroads. We had once found solace in each other's arms, but now the truth of our shared secret loomed large over every moment. One night, after another day of painful reflection, Jude and I sat together in the dim light of his small apartment. The air was heavy with regret and sorrow. "Belinda," he began softly, "I've been thinking a lot about what we're doing. I know I was drawn to you because I needed to escape my own pain, and I see now that I've only added to your suffering. I never meant to cause this much hurt, for you or for anyone else." Tears welled in my eyes as I listened. "I'm so sorry, Jude," I choked out. I thought I was finding a way to feel something again, but now I see that I've lost so much more than I ever imagined. I've hurt Charles, and I've hurt the people who care about us. I don't know how to fix this." Jude's eyes were filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "Maybe it's time we both let go," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We need to stop running from our grief and our mistakes. I want to help you heal, but I also need to find a way to heal myself. We owe it to the memory of Charles and to our own hearts to stop this secret life before it destroys us completely." That night, as the reality of our situation sank in, I made the hardest decision of my life. I decided to come clean, not only to those around me, but also to myself. I knew that the road to forgiveness would be long and painful, and that there might never be a complete return to the way things were before. But I also understood that living in lies was a slow death of the soul. I reached out to a counselor who specialized in grief and emotional trauma. Over the following weeks, I began to attend therapy sessions where I slowly unraveled the tangled emotions that had driven me into this affair. I learned that the desire to feel loved and desired was natural in the wake of deep loss, but that sometimes the methods we choose to heal can end up hurting the ones we once held dear. In one particularly raw session, I admitted the truth of my affair. I spoke about the loneliness that had overwhelmed me after Charles's death, and how Jude's presence had filled that void, if only temporarily. I wept as I recounted the pain of betrayal, not only to Charles's memory, but to the people who had trusted me. It was the first step toward understanding that my actions, while driven by a desperate need to feel alive, had come at a steep cost. Over time, the confessions began to lift a heavy burden from my shoulders. I reached out to the small circle of friends who still cared about me, and with trembling honesty, I told them everything. Some were shocked, others hurt, but most listened with compassion. In those moments, I began to see that true healing came not from hiding in the shadows of guilt, but from facing the light of truth, no matter how harsh it might be. Jude, too, took his own steps toward redemption. He met with his own therapist, grappling with the secrets and fears that had haunted him since Charles's death. In a series of heartfelt conversations, we both acknowledged that our actions, though born out of grief and loneliness, had only led us down a painful road.